Hi, welcome to 21 Wire Live. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. Thank you for joining us for this live broadcast. We're streaming out right now live on YouTube, Periscope, and also at Facebook on our 21st Century Wire fan page there. So you can watch the live stream, and this will also be available after the show at 21stcenturywire.com as a video file if you missed any of the live broadcast. Now, we're joined by a very special guest for this program. We're going to be talking about propaganda. This is a very wide subject. We'll talk about war propaganda. This is something that our readers and listeners at the Sunday Wire are also very familiar with over the years. We've covered this in relation to Syria and other conflicts. And then we're also going to talk about the propaganda paradigm with regards to the current crisis right now, the global pandemic, the issue of lockdown. We're going to be looking at a lot of different facets of this. And to help us with this discussion is someone who I regard as very much, I would like to say, an expert in this field, but certainly well published and has a lot to offer on this topic. His name is Dr. Piers Robinson, and he's joining us on the live link right now. Thank you very much for joining us, Piers.
Hi, Pat. It's a pleasure.
And as I said before, this is a very deep and wide subject. And before we get into it, I wanted to just give you an opportunity for those people who might not be familiar with your background and your expertise, your studies, the work that you published as well on this topic. If you could just give us a little bit of a summary of your background and your interest in this topic.
Well, my background is I worked as an academic looking at questions surrounding media and international politics. And my early work was on the CNN effect and these notions of humanitarian interventions. And then I worked for many years in a number of British universities as an academic and researching these areas. And then really in the last 10 years, I've become particularly focused on propaganda. I think as an academic who studied questions of media and media impact on foreign policy and conflict, I started to become increasingly aware that propaganda was one of the most important elements that we need to look at in terms of how people's understandings and behaviors and beliefs are formed, and actually primarily how power is exercised. And so I've looked and I've published on the Iraq war and the so-called dodgy dossier or the deceptive dossier on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. And then in more recent years, been looking more generally at the 9/11 global war on terror and on the conflict in Syria, and doing a lot of work on the issues surrounding the OPCW controversy regarding the alleged chemical attacks in Douma, and that's been sort of my main preoccupation for a couple of years, primarily examining questions of propaganda, British foreign policy and American in relation to the war in Syria. And I now sort of involved in a number of working groups. I'm an independent scholar, but I'm involved in a number of groups, the Organization for Propaganda Studies, the working group on Syria propaganda and media, the working group on 9/11 global war on terror, really exploring all of these issue areas, or exploring propaganda across a number of key issue areas, primarily conflict, armed conflict. And that's what I spend most of my time on these days.
Now, on the area of war propaganda, I know you've been right in the thick of it with regards to the Syrian conflict. You and your group, really from the beginning. Also, the OPCW, as you mentioned, that scandal that is related to the Syrian conflict as well, and also you've taught extensively on this subject over the years. I know, so you've kind of formulated some systems, if you will, and ways to look at how this machine works. And one of the sort of texts that's often quoted by people in this field will be, one of the main ones anyway, is the work of Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky. And this is the famous book called Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of Mass Media. And so this is normally a starting point for a mainstream discussion on this. Certainly, I don't know if that's been your experience in academia or not, but for the war propaganda issue, I think it is very useful. It's very illustrative of how various systems are working in conjunction with each other to produce this thing called consent. We talked about the Washington Consensus for Foreign Policy last week with our guest, Brian Berletic. But more specifically, is this a text that you've worked with before, that you've included in your teachings? Are you familiar with this book, and what do you think about it?
Yes, I mean, manufacturing consent is for many years has been a key text for critical scholars examining the relationship between media, political power, and politics in democracies. It's an interesting manufacturing consent because, as I think Chomsky and Edward Herman are quite happy, or were quite happy to say, that the model that they generate is not entirely their own ideas. What they have done is they've pulled together, I think, what Edward Herman described as the key factors identified across the political communication literature, which helps us to understand why the mass media, mainstream mass media, end up promoting a worldview which is compatible with powerful economic and political interests. And so the manufacturing centers are bringing together, and does reflect really a lot of the critical work in the field. And it is an important book, and it's an important argument, partly because it's been so widely adopted by critical scholars, but also because, it does do a very good job of identifying some of the primary factors, some of the primary filters which work on mainstream media. And so it's good for that. And I was, when I started studying propaganda and when I started writing about propaganda, one of the things I've increasingly come to argue is that manufacturing consent, although it's seen as a key text on propaganda, actually has relatively little to say about propaganda in the sense of how propaganda is produced and generated across various sites in society. Manufacturing consent is actually primarily about why the mass media ends up being an arm or playing a propaganda role for powerful interests. It doesn't tell you much about how propaganda is produced, and it doesn't tell you much about how people's understandings of events can become manipulated through patterns of deception, coercion, and incentivization, and so on. So whilst a useful text, as I've argued in recent years, it doesn't really, I think, really get to grips with the scale of the propaganda industry in the West. It's very much in the background of the book. So it's an excellent book, but it only takes us so far. And one of my sort of objectives, and certainly with forming the Organization for Propaganda Studies, was try to sort of bring more scholarly attention and public attention to this issue of propaganda in Western democracies.
Yeah, certainly for your classic left-wing anti-war conversation, that's a sort of a book or a text that you can refer to kind of get some common ground or understanding when you're having this conversation. And so for the first question is, now we're going to delve into the actual practical propaganda aspects. What was different? And we're going to get into current events. We're going to get into the global pandemic and lockdown. But before we get there, I think it's important to understand war propaganda as a machine, as a mechanism. What was different, in your opinion, about a conflict like the Syrian conflict as opposed to previous conflicts? Take the Iraq War, for instance. What were some of the different things, different challenges from your point of view in sort of studying and analyzing it, but how it was deployed against the public, if you will, by the vested interests that were pro-war, let's say. What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a difficult job studying propaganda, and especially in recent years, because things have been moving so fast. And I don't mean just in the last few years, I mean in the last few decades, that keeping a handle on what's going on has been very difficult. And I think that, having said that, I think if I look quite closely at the Iraq conflict, and I think when you get to the point of the Syrian war, which of course has been going on for 10 years now, extraordinarily long conflict, and of course it's a conflict which is occurring in the context of the post 9/11 regime change policies and conflicts which emerged out of that. And what really has struck me, certainly in relation to the Iraq conflict, which I looked at quite closely, is that I think with the Syrian war, you have an even more weakened mainstream media than you've had before. So Herman and Chomsky wrote in the 80s about how the mainstream media is dependent upon official sources, that it doesn't have the resources for proper investigative journalism in a way that it had perhaps in earlier eras. And I think those factors have quite simply intensified in the context of the Syrian conflict. And so, whereas with the Iraq conflict, you could in 2003, you could look around and find sort of some dissent and questioning going on in some of the mainstream media. This has been almost entirely absent in relation to Syria. It's gone. And I think that is a result of, I think it's likely to be a result of the further weakening of the mainstream media as institutions which are capable of asking questions independent of their governments. But the second dimension to, I think, the Syrian conflict is the way in which propaganda operations have been outsourced. Okay, the use of NGOs, the use of organizations which seem to be at arm's length from governments, but which are serving the purpose of mobilizing opinion, of presenting the war in a particular way. And I think that development, and of course, the kind of the examples which come to mind are in the UK context, the funding and support of the Syrian civil defense, the White Helmets, but also Inkostrat, based in Turkey, which was supporting groups within Syria trying to overthrow the Syrian government, and also activities in relation to the OPCW and the question of alleged chemical weapons attacks in Syria. And you have this sort of network of NGOs and sort of former military working in these organizations which are still funded by Western governments, but which appear to be independent, but which are playing this role of trying to encourage a particular understanding of the conflict. So whereas with the Iraq war, you could, in a way, you could look at the British government, you could say, look, there's the dossier, and there's the head of the Joint Intelligence Committee signing the intelligence dossier off an Iraqi WMD. This is coming out of the British government. That connection is cut with the Syrian conflict, which in a way makes it harder to detect the propaganda. And I think, in my view, and I just read and reviewed a book on this question of hearts and minds and propaganda in the Middle East, and this was making the point about the degree to which such operations are outsourced. And the use of contractors and so on, and I think that's an important story of the Syrian war, and one that has been told by many people, such as yourself, Vanessa Beeley, other independent journalists. But I think it's a story which will be hardened up in years to come as more and more people come to write about the conflict. And of course, the other example is as they have a book out at the moment, Bellingcat, of course, this notionally independent sort of investigative open source intelligence investigators, but really by any measure clearly closely located to Western governments, and that again becomes part of this outsourced propaganda machinery that we see in place, and it's a real. Last thing I'll say, this is a real problem for accountability. Okay, because say with the Iraq invasion, you could turn around and say, well, that was the dossier created by the British intelligence services. Maybe Alistair Campbell had a hand in it, maybe not. Maybe it's more the intelligence services who are helping to create a dossier which gave a very misleading assessment of Iraq's WMD capability. But you could at least point at the government, say this is your responsibility, and that's more difficult to do, I think, with the Syrian war. Not that it can't be done, and I think it is being done, and I think the working group I'm a part of on Syria, propaganda and media has made a lot of progress, along with other independent journalists, as I've mentioned before, in starting to map that apparatus. But it does become more challenging to do, definitely. But I think that's one of the big stories with the Syrian conflict.
Yeah, well, last week we were trying to deconstruct with my guest Brian Berlitic, how the consensus is arrived at, because this is also very important in selling something like a war. So this is really very crucial to how propaganda is used and whether it's effective or not, how the operations are designed, who's involved in them as well. And so we talked about how this foreign policy machine works, and I'm sure you're very familiar with most of these concepts, but we'll just do a very quick review of that process, and then we're going to try to use this to overlay on a couple of other situations. So it really started with the heart of it in terms of how this diagram works, or this theory works, is that you have transnational corporations, you have big finance. If you believe that these are the interests that drive governments at the end of the day, or the most influential at the end of the day, global capital, if you will. There's various different ways to describe this. And they put money into something in America called the think tank industry, if you will. You could also put the NGOs as well into this category as well, human rights NGOs. And from there, the think tanks supply the ideas, the policies, the pundits, if you will, to the mainstream media. And you see them on all the main networks. A lot of these are the members of these various different organizations, or they're journalists who are also getting their information from those same think tanks, politicians as well, who are getting them from lobbyists, from think tanks, coming through that same pipeline. And then that helps to form the Washington consensus. And then it moves on, and that's really how U.S. policy is arrived at, long-term continuity of policy. And then it moves on to market stability, and that market stability is really what the transnational corporations and big finance are looking for at the end of the day. So in this theory here, this is how this consensus is arrived at. So propaganda is very, very important to make this work. It's really the grease that makes this machine work in terms of influencing public opinion through media. And so you also have corporations directly funding media as well. That supercharges this process as well. And again, the NGOs are a big part of this in terms of creating that human rights conversation that was really used, a central part of the Syrian narrative, the Libyan narrative, everything connected with the Arab Spring as well. Very much a human rights conversation, pro-democracy, pro-freedom, international freedom, and things like this. So looking at this, so this is a way to manufacture consent, a type of way you could say theoretically that consent is manufactured for war. So if you take this and you, let's say, have another effort for propaganda, and this is where I wanted we're going to do a radical departure from war here. These transnational corporations, they could be Boeing, they could be Lockheed Martin, they could be Raytheon, General Electric, Citibank, JP Morgan, BAE Systems. All of these are companies that are involved in the war effort generally. And I'm just naming a few, some of the bigger ones. They also have overlap with the board positions of major mainstream media conglomerates. Certainly that's the case in the United States. You see overlap, some of the same people sitting on the boards of defense and media as well. Comcast or Disney, NBC International, General Electric owns, I believe, NBC as well, CNN, Time Warner Communications. So that's been well documented and proven. So now we have a different war that's happening right now, or a different crisis. we have a global pandemic. And the corporations that are central in this are not necessarily defense contractors, but a lot of them are, you could say, transnational pharmaceutical companies, biosurveillance companies, some of the same companies that really came into their own post 9/11, that type of, like the security industrial complex. We have a new industrial complex that's emerging right now in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. So my question to you is, do you think this similar type of system is applicable when you're looking at war propaganda and arriving at consensus or policy? Do you think there's some similarities in how would you describe this current global crisis right now in this sense?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is that the graphic you're presenting there is a graphic which is pretty much compatible with what Herman and Chomsky were arguing back in the 80s. And of course, it's called Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media. And the key words in there is this notion of political economy. It's this idea of networks of politically powerful and economically powerful groups who, through a variety of mechanisms, produce propaganda in order to maintain a worldview which is compatible with their interests. And that's the sort of the basic underlying sort of logic of the propaganda model as articulated by Herman and Chomsky. And when they produced it, they applied it to war and conflict, but they were always very clear that this applies more generally to Western societies and democracies. We live in democracies in societies where there is very large concentration of wealth and power into particular economic actors and political actors. And that's the case today. And when we see something with COVID-19, it's the same. We have an issue, an event which is occurring in a context where, yes, we have powerful actors, powerful economic and powerful political actors, and that reality means, as has been, I pointed out at the beginning of the COVID-19 issue, is that reality means that we must always be extremely alert to powerful actors exploiting circumstances for political gain, and that's certainly takes us to where we are with COVID-19. So in general terms, to answer, yes, this is applicable in that sense. That whatever's going on with COVID-19, it's occurring in a context where we have now a greater point, to a greater degree than any point, I think, in our history, is concentration of power and wealth into certain institutions, companies, political actors. And our political nose should be telling us, actors will exploit this, and then it's our task to try and find where that's occurring, and then to try and stop it and hold them to account, which is, of course, in a sense, the rationale for Herman Chomsky's manufacturing consent was to try and give people the tools with which to understand the way in which power is exercised, and then to try and counter that and to make the world more democratic and for there to be greater accountability. So that kind of spirit of manufacturing consent should absolutely be being applied to the situation we're in now, and trying to understand, who are the winners, who are the losers, who is playing to exploit this crisis, who isn't. I mean, there are people who won't be, people who will be responding to it in a sort of honest, straightforward way. But the question of where the power lies in this, and who might be trying to seek advantage out of it, is a critical one, which we should always be doing in a democracy, right? We should always be asking those kind of questions. And of course, that doesn't mean that you're sort of saying that things are unreal necessarily, or etc. That kind of, when people create a straw man, you question something, so, what are you saying? This is all a giant, the conspiracy theory label, and so on. And of course, what one is saying is not necessarily that. One is saying that powerful actors exploit things for their own interests. If you want to try and smear that as conspiracy theory, well, you're just smearing it because, hate to break the news, but that's a fact of politics. You have powerful actors who do engage in activities which are to shore up their own interests, and deception and manipulation and incentivization, coercion is all part of that. That's the reality of the world we're in. And so that's what we're talking about here. And it's not to exclude necessarily any possibilities as to what's going on, but it's, the key thing here is that there is more going on. There's always politics going on. There's always politics going on in relation to the war on terror. There's always politics going on in relation to COVID-19 and virus, and as you said, sort of how to respond to them, what to do, etc. And those are the things which we should be critically exploring at times such as this. And for sure, that framework is as applicable to the current situation as I think it is to war and conflict. And this was really always the point of that book and that set of arguments by Herman and Chomsky.
And one of the great pieces of work that I know that you've done, in my opinion, and many others, is also your work in analyzing the Chilcot report, and then using that to connect to the timeline of events of the Iraq War, specifically how the United States and the UK government were colluding, conspiring, if you will, and that it was really a foregone conclusion, and that the public face of what they were talking about was really just for show. There was absolute lockstep to go to war. You've more or less proved that in a number of the points that you've analyzed on that. But from what you learned from that, and one of the things I took away from your analysis of that, plus the media reporting at the time, was that there was this inertia, that there were big forces at play, and once this train was moving down the tracks, it couldn't be turned back at some point. And I think that's important in relation to the current crisis, because not every country has adopted the same responses to COVID-19 in terms of lockdowns, etc. So what I'm asking is the political side of events, which you know very well from your work on analyzing the Chilcot report. Is it possible, or do you think that there's an argument to be made that inertia, that political inertia, is also could also be at play here, where instead of going back, the governments or politicians really double down. It becomes a bigger issue once things are moving forward. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a really good thing to bring in there. This issue of the global war on terror and some of the work I had done on that, because that's precisely the issue with the global war on terror. Is the thing gets kicked off, and then before you know it, you've got war after war being generated as a result. It becomes a train which is on the tracks and cannot be stopped. And of course, the global war on terror hasn't stopped really. I mean, I know it gets renamed in some ways, but we could well be seeing a war with Iran, let alone situations with Russia and China. So when you have these policies implemented, and of course after 9/11 you have the Patriot Act, you have this sort of closing down on civil liberties, you have bulk surveillance of the population and so on, as well as all of the kind of Islamophobia associated with the war on terror, and that has dramatically changed our societies over the last 20 years, as well as kicked off wars which have killed enormous numbers of people. And I think that's precisely the concern here with COVID-19. You've had the event, you've had COVID-19 occur, as you had with 9/11, you have the event, and then after that you then have policies being solidified, and then you're on a train and you can't get away from it. And I guess the big fear at the moment is that it's very clear who's advocating lockdown and restrictions. It's very clear who is advocating a particular understanding of this virus, which, sort of the zero COVID ideas, or the vaccine is the only solution. And they're all quite out in the open about this, but you can see that the kind of power and money and force behind that will actually restructure potentially our societies. Talk of the war on domestic terrorism in the US, for example, all of these are incredibly concerning and should be incredibly concerning. And this is what I think, any propaganda analyst this is what they should be trying to focus on now, is trying to understand what political and economic consequences are emerging out of the COVID event, and which are being solidified and which are being driven to take us down a particular path. I'm probably talking far too gently about it, in the sense that it's extraordinary that we have the infringement on our civil liberties that we have now. It's extraordinary through lockdown. It's extraordinary the infringement on freedom of speech we have through big tech censorship. It's got so bad now that even incredibly mainstream and extremely well-known academics are complaining of censorship. For example, Sunetra Gupta from the University of Oxford, a leading academic studies who are epidemiologist, and you've got people like that who are saying that we're being censored, etc., and we're being attacked as well. And I think that's the very worrying and scary thing about the situation we're in now, is that if anything, we see this intensification of or concentration of power, actually. And what have we seen in the last year? We've seen, I think, even the WEF itself sort of talks about the K-shaped recovery, where there's been this huge upward transfer in wealth. The professional classes and big tech are coming out of this looking good, and the people who are really getting hit hard, working class, lower socioeconomic groups, and so on. And in that mix of this kind of intensification of inequality in society, we then have this kind of emergence of politicians, and I saw sort of Angela Merkel yesterday talking about in Germany, well, we're not sure when we can start to give you your freedoms back, which is incredible. I mean, who would have thought we'd be at this point a year ago? It's extraordinary. And so, yeah, I think an intensification, in a way, of the concentration of political power that we saw accelerating following 9/11 in the context of the global war on terror, now, as it were, segued into this issue of sort of virus and control and fears, exploiting people's fears over, I guess, what culturally is quite a deep-rooted fear, isn't it? So if you go back to the Black Plague and so on, and you think of Hollywood movies like Outbreak and so on. This is something which, unlike terrorism, where I think a lot of people thought, well, I'm probably not going to be, not likely to be attacked. With COVID-19, everybody becomes a threat to you. Anybody could have this virus, and this becomes a very powerful sort of fear which can be readily exploited. And frankly, from what I've seen over the last year, I mean, that does seem to be what is going on. I mean, I think sort of Peter Hitchens, the Mail on Sunday journalist, talks about isn't it extraordinary that this is probably the first virus in history where we have to be regularly told about it, warned, and have big, scary adverts, etc. Sort of people, this idea that there is an exaggeration or a ramping up, I think is reasonably well established, and certainly corroborated by the fact that we know that there are behavioral psychologists and SPI-B in the UK working to, what was their own terminology in that document which came out, to sort of increase the fear levels. We see big tech censoring scientists who are questioning what's going on. And so all of that sort of reinforces this idea that there is a ramping up of levels of fear for reasons which we need to get to the bottom of. But we don't have, we're certainly not in a situation where there is, as it were, properly independent reporting in the mainstream media of what's going on. I think I don't think, a few years back, you'd probably be accused of being a conspiracy theorist when you make those kind of claims, or just a traditional lefty critiquing the media. But I've seen so many high-profile people saying this very clearly, that there's propaganda going on, that there's these sort of expectations on broadcasters in the UK about not allowing too much dissent. There's the money flows, which you've mentioned, which I think have been identified by some people. And then you have 77th Brigade, you have people who have asked questions, and actually pretty tame questions, getting hammered in social media and smeared. I think that, again, to name her again, but Professor Gupta was called a conspiracy theorist for arguing that from a medical point of view, the lockdown response was not the way to deal with a new virus, that there are better ways of handling that. And I've lost track, to be quite honest. Didn't our friend George Monbiot had an argument with Naomi Wolf last week, and it seemed to follow his an editorial by him in the Guardians saying something along the lines that we needed, some kind of rigorous censorship and gatekeeping of what information can be heard and what information can't be heard.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. First thing I'll say is this idea of big tech censorship, that's not a problem that we had to overcome as a society or any particular country in the Iraq War, for instance. The coverage was through mainstream media, international corporations, local, national media, and now you have a global town square, if you will, that's really mediated by a very small number of people, mainly in Silicon Valley, but they're also working with governments. Governments are putting pressure on them to censor as well. And every time you go on Facebook or YouTube, or sometimes on Twitter, but a COVID-19 information roadblock appears. If you post anything on Facebook, for instance, that mentions COVID, YouTube, it's under every single video that's applicable, and is always linking back to official sources, to the government. And there's this idea that there's a scientific consensus that changes by the minute, by the way, but still, it's a scientific consensus that emanates from government. This is a whole new paradigm. So the Chomsky-Herman analysis really would need to be updated. There would need to be a major overhaul to keep pace with this new aspect of it now, that I think is actually the dominant aspect, and the traditional media is really lagging behind, because as we know from the polls, Piers, the trust in mainstream media, it's at historic lows, and so people don't regard it as credible or trustworthy. But yet everybody's on the main social media platforms, on the internet. Google is also very censored in terms of what the search results are for any story on the first 10 pages, let's say. And that wasn't the case at the beginning of when search engines came out. They weren't gaming the search results like they are now. So everything's being funneled to a very sort of narrow band of information and narratives right now. But yeah, just quickly your view on that.
I think that it is correct to say that sort of the models from earlier eras need updating, given this information environment we have, and given the technology that they have available to them. I mean, this is something which I think people have written about. I've written about it a little bit. And it's certainly the case that the social media environment, the dynamics are the same. It's big, powerful corporations having excessive influence over these information spaces, but it's the technology available to them, because on the one hand, the internet is this kind of liberating, democratizing, or it has the potential for that, but then the technology itself allows the propagandists, the manipulators, much more scope for targeting information, for and algorithms, etc. And really, the technology they have now seems to be quite extraordinary in terms of how it can manipulate the information space. And if what you are getting at is that things are possibly worse, I think in some ways, yes, things are worse. But at the same time, there are still people fighting and trying to use the internet for, as a proper open source of information and to get for proper free speech purposes. They haven't been able to close that down entirely. But I mean, in my mind, the jury's out. I mean, I think the situation is worse than it was before. I do think that mainstream media in an earlier era would have had at least a stronger culture and financial backing to engaging a degree of criticism. So in the Vietnam War, you did have some impressive bits of journalism at certain points in that conflict. And I think that's just completely absent. If you look at Syria, it's gone. I mean, there's no Walter Cronkites, there's no Sy Hirsches in the case of Syria in the mainstream media. They're all independent. So I think it has got worse. At the same time, what we're seeing at the moment, and the point I made earlier, I think you did, that these seem to be very extreme times, and I think they're extraordinarily extreme times and very scary times. I mean, this is something which is affecting, I'm sure you feel the same, and with our friends, families, people are extremely alarmed about what's going on at the moment. So these are extreme times, but it's also times in which, because things are becoming more extreme, they're also becoming more obvious, right? The potential for more people, the numbers of people I've seen, I won't name them, friends and family, who said, I never thought before that the BBC was quite as untrustworthy as I do now. People who had normally sort of, thought, well, the BBC is quite good, it's, etc. The numbers of people who've woken up to the fact that no, the BBC is not independent of government in a way that it presents itself as, is much greater now. So there's much more potential for people to wake up now. As to the scale of propaganda, the realities of mainstream media. And there's hope in that, but it is, I mean, I think is everyone holding their breath a little bit after what happened in the US election, and with Biden talking about this this domestic war on terror and the kind of the threat of ever increasing control over the information based upon protecting people. I think everyone's waiting to see how bad is this going to get. And it could get worse. It's bad enough as it is at the moment. But then, I think if that happens, I suspect, and my recommendation would be to activists, is to start seriously about, going back to traditional methods of printing and going door to door. Actually, in some ways, it might be good if those of us who try to engage in free speech and free inquiry on the internet also think a little bit in terms of, well, the old-fashioned ways of going door-to-door printed material, maybe we should not lose sight of that. Maybe we can combine these technologies, because there's a lot less they can do about that, big tech. And I bet you, if, for example, if you look at some of the mainstream organizations which have formed in order to question, for example, lockdown strategy, and I think in the UK, is it T4 recovery is a fairly mainstream one, which is critical of lockdown. I bet you if those organizations started to push out sort of leaflets and going door to door, that would really scare the government, the powers that be, because they think, well, how on earth do we handle that? Are we going to start stopping people going door to door, kind of thing? I guess what I'm getting at here is that how the bad things get with the kind of control that you're talking about, there are always moves which people can take to try to protect, or to get the truth out, or try to protect their right to free speech, which, I know these are difficult times for talking about that kind of thing, but this is what democracies rest upon. We need free speech. We need people to be able to express their opinions freely and without fear of being attacked. Because if we don't allow that, we don't have democracy. If we don't allow that, we run the risk of powerful actors controlling the agenda and what we think and what we do, and it all breaks down. We're back to a different, a thoroughly non-democratic setup, and you kind of think to yourself sometimes, we shouldn't have to be saying these things. Isn't this obvious? But I mean, actually, I think a restatement of what democracy is, what it involves, what free speech involves, right? it means tolerating opinions. It doesn't mean the right to threaten. We know that's always been ruled out. But this idea that people, we need to respect people's opinions and listen to them, and allow them to express their views on issues. And if it's a bad argument, you allow that argument to circulate and be challenged. You don't suppress it. You don't try and censor it. But there seems to be a lot of people, and good old George Monbiot himself need a good reminding of that basic democratic fact.
Yeah, a lot of it is also, the big conversation is the post-truth world. I think that was even the name of Bellingcat's documentary that I think they probably won an award for, maybe an Emmy Award or something. Who knows? They're constantly being showered with awards. But that's been the big topic of conversation, the big kind of moral crusade of the liberal intelligentsia, especially in Washington, since the era of Trump, especially, and Russiagate. Again, this is the same establishment that for 5 years has been pushing the official conspiracy theory that the Russians installed Donald Trump into the White House in 2016, and then they're decrying the post-truth world and blaming it on the internet fringe and things like this. So here is the problem in that the current atmosphere is so hysterical, and I honestly think there's a fundamental structural problem, and it's not necessarily the internet and the free availability of information. To me, I think it's the structural problem is this shifting window where people are very dependent on official sources of information to make it through a crisis or to understand, quote, what's happening within a crisis. So the reliance on the experts, reliance on, quote, the science, the government, that can be the only source, or mainstream media outlets, back to them again. They're validating certain facts, if you will. So this is what got us into trouble with things like the Iraq War, when the entire establishment media turned their whole Titanic in one direction, which was weapons of mass destruction, and there wasn't any dissent tolerated. We're having the same problem now. I think there is an emergence of a lot of important arguments with regards to the global pandemic, like the PCR testing controversy as an example. But this isn't getting any airtime in terms. It's not altering the trajectory of the discussion. It's not changing policy. It's not causing that pause to say, "Whoa, we're basing all of this in the same way that the weapons of mass destruction was really relied on the technicians, the David Kellys of the world, the Hans Blitzes of the world, the weapons experts, and then the media would defer to them." We have a similar situation here. Drosten in Germany is a good example with regards to the PCR machine, and so that's the central data producer, if you will, that informs policy for lockdowns, for mass testing, for everything, for travel restrictions, closing borders, is all based on the technical capability of this test. And so, but if the government's saying everything's fine, if the Times, the Telegraph, the BBC is saying everything's fine, CNN, Washington Post, no problem with the test, just ignoring it, then we're relying on the, quote, experts again. And politicians are, what I'm probably trying to say is, politicians are all too willing to defer, to pass the buck, if you will, to their science advisor, to their chief medical officer, for fear of getting it, quote, wrong. Maybe that was the same with the Iraq War, Piers. I don't know.
Well, I mean, this is an important area which is quite close to my heart. Is this question of experts and the academy and academia, And I think one of the arguments I make about propaganda is that, we sort of think of it, well, it's to do with PR activity, it's to do with the media and so on. But I think it's in my position is that it's been very clear that, the arguments that Herman and Chomsky make in relation to mainstream media, they apply to academia. And I wrote an article on this with Eric Herring years ago on a special issue on Noam Chomsky, saying that all of these filters, they work for academia. And I think we're seeing this very clearly in the case of COVID-19, that academia is not independent in the way that it's supposed to be. And frankly, I think this applies to most institutions in Western society, that sort of, the idea of parliaments holding the executive to account, the idea of the mass media holding power to account, the role of academics being displaced by think tanks who are funded by big corporations. All of this means that we are living in a highly propagandized world where the institutions which are meant to be the bedrock of democracy are significantly hollowed out. And one of the things we need to do as we navigate through the nightmare of the COVID response from governments is to recognize that and to start to try and fight to restore our institutions, restore the universities back to their places as areas of independent thinking, restore democracy within our parliaments, and so on. Deal with the think tanks, etc., and also critically to start to try to really work harder to educate the public and people, and to give them the skills and the confidence to think for themselves and to challenge and to question. This is what we need. This notion that something I noticed and I discussed when I gave a talk at a Labour Party group in Lewisham a year or so back, was this idea that the schooling systems are not really cultivating independence of thought. And it's actually something I noticed somewhat in my time as an academic in university, as the A-level students coming in. And I think, we have lost sort of the kind of courage and independence of thought that we perhaps had in earlier eras. But what all of this means is that this is a huge exercise we have ahead of us to deal with the problem that we're in now, where we have such a concentration of power that I'd argue we don't really have meaningful democracy in any sense in the West. And that's largely because the institutions have been hollowed out, and it includes the education system, as I've been saying. And this is a big, long struggle now, I think, to try and get ourselves back to building the society and the political systems which are democratic and which are going to work for people, and which are not going to lead us into endless wars or lead us into situations where we have now, as I think Martin Kulldorff, the American Harvard professor, pointed out, that the COVID lockdown response is great for the professional classes. You can sit there at home and work at home. Absolutely hell on poor people and the working class who are terrified about where the money's going to come from. So we avoid that kind of, and this is your point about the left, is the failure of the left to look after its core constituents, I think is very clear in this case. But this is going to need root and branch reform of our institutions, or restoration of our institutions, and it's going to be a big, long fight. This will be a struggle, I think. And I hope we win. We might lose, and then we're in trouble. But I think we will win this. But this will be a struggle which I think will take up the bulk of the remainder of our lives, you and I think, at the age we're at. And this is what we're going to be having to do for quite a long time.
A key
so at least life will be interesting.
Well, there's no doubt about that. Too interesting for some people's taste. But the key thing you said there was taking responsibility for becoming informed, and you saying that this has been ground away gradually over the years, whereby people are becoming dependent on Wikipedia and these Ministry of Truth cutouts, many of them online, for instance. People aren't reading as much. But that really speaks to a point that was made in Thomas Sowell, who's an American academic. He's at Stanford at the Hoover Institution. He published a book, I think it was in 2009. It was called Intellectuals and Experts. And what his argument was that the centralization of power, or the centralization of authority into these small cliques or cadres of science, high priests, if you will, of science or orthodoxy. The problem is, if they get it wrong, the mistake ripples right across the system. And his argument was that if you look at history, knowledge, wisdom, information is always spread out over a very wide area. And so the smart thing is to allow the market to send the marketplace of ideas, if you will, to send back the signals as to what works and what doesn't. And this is how you form, this is a better way of forming a more accurate consensus as to what the right policy might be, or the right approach might be, rather than to rely on a sort of high committee that's almost untouchable, that's in a fortress, a political fortress, really. And I'm going to say that this is what it looks like is happening now. I can speak to the British government science advisors. They've been wrong on just about everything from the beginning of the crisis, and they've just moved the goalpost. Their solution has been just move the goalpost. I think they're on the 100th goalpost move right now.
Yeah.
And in the United States, it's the same thing. It's a very narrow, monolithic set of ideas and policies. Very difficult to move. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, and for sure, I mean, this case and Sage is what you're referring to. I mean, this is the criticism and the concerns which have been raised, and you know, I've heard it many times now from various scientists, that this is not an open, proper forum for evaluating all of the issues in relation to COVID-19. Quite aside from conflicts of interest issues and so on, and who's on has various shares in various companies, etc. This is not what science looks like. And actually, in my own work on the OPCW issue, you see the same pattern. You see this sidelining of science, okay, and scientific method and scientific rigor. You see it in the case, of course, of the 9/11 issue and the Alaska Fairbanks study and the NIST study into the building collapses. You see the same problem of essentially the corruption of genuinely independent, objective scientific process. And you know, the point I made earlier is that maybe at least things have become so clear now with COVID and what we see with Sage, and as you say, this also applies in the US context as well, where you have an incredibly narrow range of scientists, some of whom don't have direct expertise necessarily, who are running the show, the Drostons, the Neil Fergusons, etc. And I'm hoping that this, you know, I'm hoping that as this comes to unravel in the coming months, maybe years, that this will be a lesson that will be properly learned. That we, you know, we need to encourage, your point, diversity. Ensure that universities are properly diverse in terms of range of opinions. That we're not sidelining, you know, professors simply because they hold views which are deemed too controversial. There's an awful lot of that going on these days, because this is incredibly dangerous. The flip side, one could be provocative. I know we're coming to the end, but provocative in all of this is that one of the reasons I think that we're seeing so much propaganda is that many of aspects of Western society and policies are underpinned by very big deceptions. Okay, and this is the argument, you know, I made about the global war on terror. And when you saw the Chilcot report, and you see Tony Blair and George Bush discussing which countries they're going to hit and next, kind of thing. Sort of, it becomes very clear that the level of deception in Western democracies is very high across a huge range of issues now. And I think that is what in a way is forcing, I think, the censorship, the propaganda being ratcheted up. And you know, societies don't live forever based upon lies or on these kind of scales. You know, the role of the West in the war on terror and what the conflict of violence that has occurred across the world because of what we have been initiating and doing, let alone the issues surrounding 9/11. These are things which, and I've always thought, will come home to haunt us or our children or our grandchildren. So the Iraq War, ultimately what was done there, the truth will come out. So these are things which have to be addressed. But these deceptions are very big, and I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing what we're seeing. You're seeing a concentration of power. Elements trying to hold on to power. And all they have left at the moment is a lot of deception and, of course, terrifying people over COVID-19 and offering them needles. It's not an awful lot that the if you want to sort of use a kind of Marxist term, that the ruling class has to offer these days, but it's needles and fear, and I don't think that will carry on forever. I think there is an opportunity now for people to start the long, hard struggle to deal with all the problems that people like you and others like us who have talked and written critically about our democracies. We've been saying this for a long time, and I think the problems that we've identified and talked about a long time are crystallizing and are becoming very clear now. So that creates an opportunity for positive change in the coming years, hopefully.
I don't know if you have I know we only plan to go for an hour. I don't know. Do you have any extra time? I've got a few propaganda exhibits.
I've got a bit of extra time. I have got evening meal and family
waiting. Okay.
But so I another 10 minutes, 15 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to bring your attention to a couple of things. That just going back a little bit to where we were. I did a basic paradigm here, just trying to look at what's the problem I'm having with this, Piers, is it's the motivation, it's the state of mind, it's the psychology of the public, and we more or less know the psychological devices that are being employed by government, and so in terms of the war effort, as it were. This is what we normally would see. These two forces are kind of pushing against each other. On the government, the pro-war side, it's the threat, it's the security imperative. On the anti-war side, it's the moral, the ethical argument. Then you have the emotional argument for war as well. Then we have the skepticism, the restraint on the other side, the anti-war argument. And we must act now. This is also something that we see. And then we want to wait, pause. We need to interrogate the evidence. This is what we see on the dissenting side, the anti-war side. Then blame is very important, attributing blame on the pro-war side. Preemptive strikes are usually the result of that. And then we have the precautionary principle, which is a type of a precautionary principle being called for on the anti-war side. And we have the invocation of patriotism. This is something that we see with the drive to war. And you see where I'm going with this in a minute, as how we transpose this onto the global pandemic. And the anti-war will make the moral case. Then both sides are making a kind of a human rights argument. The pro-war side it's the human rights argument. We need to save the people who are being oppressed, responsibility to protect, etc. And the anti-war side's also making a human rights argument, where this war is illegal. This isn't right. People are going to die from the bombing campaigns. So when we have this pitched battle of ideas, of political forces, the moral argument is extremely strong, Piers, on the anti-war side, and it has won out in history, although in a delayed fashion. Eventually, it usually has a global consensus. It has a fantastic constituency on the political left normally, and moderates too, and also some conservatives as well. There's an anti-war vein in the conservatives. So this has always been very strong. And if you look at how Tony Blair fell from grace, is really because of the Iraq War, and there was really a moral argument behind his demise, that the Iraq War was immoral, it was illegal, and he lied about it. So in the end, although the arc of history bends towards justice, as they say, as I believe Martin Luther King said so famously, it does take a long time to move along that line for war. So if we just alter this slightly for the pandemic, we see some of the same things, but things are getting a lot more confusing. Now the government or the pharmaceutical industrial complex or the pro-lockdown lobby, they also are making a moral argument. Things are much more convoluted. It is really under the it literally gets under the surface of the general population in a way that a remote, distant war and halfway across the world can't. And so I think there's a major problem here in terms of making that argument for restraint. Both sides are making a precautionary principle type of argument, although the pro-lockdown government side's not really making a precautionary principle for lockdown. Early on, we saw Dr. David Katz from Yale University, the Great Barrington Declaration. They've made definitely a moral argument, a precautionary argument against lockdown, for instance, but the government's not having it. Silicon Valley's not having it. Mainstream media is not really having it. They're not accepting that as a legitimate argument and we have the invocation of patriotism. So a kind of a revival of the Blitz spirit. Certainly that's what we're seeing in the UK. Saving lives versus human rights, lockdown, civil liberties issues. What I'm saying, Piers, is both sides are canceling each other out on many of these different fronts, and it's extremely difficult to make the kind of arguments that you might make in the past when you opposed a war, for instance. This is incredibly complex and multi-layered. But just your general thoughts. What are your first thoughts on this?
Well, in some ways, I think I agree. I mean, I think this is an interesting exercise to go through and think through what are the key elements in relation to war propaganda, and then how is that changing in the context of COVID-19. And I can see some of the things that you're saying and how they bear upon what we're seeing at the moment. I mean, part of me feels, and in carrying on your exercise, is that with war, you have this, arguments which are charged with emotion, nationalism, patriotism, fear, and which are quite difficult in a kind of scientific way to evaluate. So, you have a claim that this country is a threat and so on. And in some ways, go back to the Iraq War. Well, maybe Iraq is a threat. Maybe it could become a threat, etc. When we're not friends, and those arguments have in some ways difficult to challenge. And what strikes me in the case of COVID-19 is that actually the response, the policy response, i.e., lockdown and try to control the virus, as opposed to simply allowing the virus to do what other viruses do and allow natural immunity to build up. These are really very closely or very clearly located in scientific discourse. This is a scientific question, right? What do you do about what is the best thing to do? What is COVID? What is the best thing to do? And so on. And in a sense, it is amenable to very rational discussion and establishing the truth in a way that wars aren't. And I think that the only way that has been prevented in this case is that the degree of propaganda has just had to be ratcheted up, to the point where you're attacking reputable scientists who are raising questions. And so I understand the point that in some ways it seems complicated. I think it is perhaps more different, as it were, than actually necessarily more complicated. And I do think at the heart of the COVID issue, it is something which can be scientifically resolved if we allowed proper engagement between the scientists. This is factual stuff. You can look at the graphs. You can determine, does lockdown work or not? And of course, this has been the argument of dissidents such as Peter Hitchens, is that this is just look at the facts. Which means that the problem in itself is perhaps potentially easier to resolve than the kind of pro and anti-war arguments. That's my kind of feeling. But just as a first off response to what you're saying. But I think there is some truth in what you're saying. I do think that okay, say in terms of war propaganda, if you've got a country which is directly under threat, it's not difficult to mobilize people. Second World War, people are sure, okay, we're in trouble here, we're in danger. Most of the wars that we've been talking about are wars where the West isn't under any direct threat, but it wants to go to war, so it needs to manufacture and propagandize in a very significant level. And that's what war propaganda has been about, I think, in the West since the Second World War, to nearly all the time. It's been about sort of exaggerating threats, creating threats which weren't really there, in order to justify military action. Now, this case with COVID-19, we're talking about a claim about a virus which is going to, kill you. And some people think that this virus is equally dangerous to everybody in society, which of course is not true. That there are high-risk groups, and then the bulk of the population is not a high-risk virus, and less so, in fact, than the flu, I think, for younger people, and so on. So you have this kind of fear of a virus and making people fear it in a way to the exclusion of all other illnesses which are there. Okay, which were cancers and heart disease, etc. And part of me thinks that it is more complex, but it's also, this seems to be a very fragile propaganda bubble that we have here. That the idea that people will remain gripped with the fear of one virus, which has whatever degree of lethality it actually has it in reality, but it's and there's lots of arguments about that. But the idea that people will remain gripped and in a state of fear of something which is endemic now and which will come and go as all other viruses, to the point where they're not thinking about other conditions. I think it will just implode in people's minds at some point. I don't know when, but I think at some point people will say, well, there might be risky viruses out there, but there always have been, and we have to live. And, I've just got a cancer, I've got that cancer diagnosis, so I have to deal with that, or I've got the heart problems or my cholesterol, and people will start to get a more balanced, realistic take on this. So I don't know. I mean, I could be wrong, and you could be absolutely right in that chart you've created. But I would put out the possibility that it's not more complicated. That in a sense that they're having to work harder to propagandize, and actually the issue is in some ways is a relatively simple one, and then maybe I'm just being hopelessly naive here. That people will just at some point do what I've lost count of the number of quite conservative friends and family who I've spoken to, who said right from the start, saying, well, okay, there might be this, but this doesn't warrant doing this. Mm-hmm. What about all of, or old people being isolated? I mean, this is what the German professor Bakti was saying early on, saying you isolate people in their closing years, in their twilight years. They don't see their family, they don't see their grandchildren. This is, what would you, put yourself in this position, what would you want? If you're in an old people's home and you've got maybe a year left, would you want to be restricted, or would you want to say, I don't care, I might get the virus, I want to see my grandchildren? I know what I would choose. So I in some ways, I think, is this more simple? And people will just suddenly realize, or everyone, I think a lot of people have realized. And then this goes to this point actually I made before, that this is a terrifying thing that we're all going through, and this concentration of power we're seeing is terrifying, and the exploitation of it by political actors, WF, whoever, is terrifying. But it's fragile. I don't think they can keep this going forever. I think that with the global war on terror, they were able to say, well, there's terrorists out there, and there'd be events here and events there, and to keep that going, although not forever. By the time I got to Syria, and we were kind of sort of working in unison with groups who were formerly Al-Qaeda and so on, that narrative was breaking down to a significant extent. So that broke down eventually. But I think with this, and because this is so immediate to everyone's daily experience, and people are like, this is really directly affecting our lives. And then this the capacity for people to carry on living in fear, I think, and again, I could be wrong, but I feel that people are just, it's going to burst. The bubble will burst at some point, and some kind of calm, considered sort of position will take hold as a consensus position. This hasn't happened yet, as you just pointed out and reminded me. But, you know, I mean, really, I mean, you know, when they are now talking, you know, about zero COVID, which is, from what I understand from epidemiologists who I trust, is just a crazy idea. When you see that being circulated, and this notion of almost this kind of permanent lock, so we're going to lock down every time we get a new variant comes in, oh, okay, we've got to lock down. I mean, this is not living anymore, right? This is, you know, we've caged ourselves, and people will just go, and I'm sure a lot of people have done already. Well, even if this virus was actually considerably more risky than it actually is for most of the population, you'd be saying, well, I'll take the risk, thank you very much. Reminds me of that John Travolta film from years ago. Was it in the 70s? An early appearance where he's a boy in the bubble kind of thing, and he finds his sud the bubble, I want to go riding on a horse with my girlfriend. You know, at some point you just realize this is enough. And we can't be a billion miles away from that.
No, the hypochondria is sad, but it's not. It's a very real thing, and people have developed, I think, habits and psychological fixations and beliefs that are not going to go away anytime soon, and that's really heavy.
I agree. I mean, I appear to talk lightly about all of these things, but it makes me extremely angry when I see, and I have personal experience, and my wife is a deputy head teacher, and seeing the potential damage and long-term damage that this will be doing to people who will just get health anxiety. And it's a miserable existence that we're setting up, a lot of people for. I saw a headline just the other day that was it alcohol deaths, is it, in Britain, has just rocketed. And somebody said, oh, we need to have an inquiry into this. And I think as Tara McCormack and also Laura Dodds point out, we don't need an inquiry. This is obvious that this would happen, that people who are already on the edge, who are already suffering battles against alcohol, or whatever other drugs, this will push them over the edge, obviously. And this does, this is where I think in all of this, there is going to have to be a reckoning, and there is going to have to be a holding to account. And if we can get a proper scientific discussion going at some point where we get a clear, rational response to this virus, then scientists, and they know who they are, but scientists who have been propagandizing, or scientists, for example, this issue of people such as Susie Mitchie and the behavioral psychologists who have been willingly executing the policy through how do we ramp up fear levels. That's an ethical issue. Those academics need to be held to account, and through mechanisms in universities or even legally. I mean, this is the whole Rainer Fulmish PCR stuff against Drosten, and there's similar actions elsewhere, I think, beginning to develop. But people are going to have to be held to account for their actions in this. People who've been in positions of power and who have advocated policies which have, for example, led to the old people being pushed out of hospitals into the care homes, everything associated with that, that needs to be looked at through and through, hopefully in the coming years. But this is serious. Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is very, very worrying. It's, that point I made earlier, it's easy for, as the WEF said itself, this is easy for the professional classes who can work at home, who've got state-linked jobs, etc. This is, I think, was it the Chardonnay sort of holiday that one British journalist referred to it as, it's not difficult, and we can smile and laugh about it, but, there'll be, the family down the road who are facing the abyss of the business is going to go, the business can't carry on. And this is, my personal view and feelings is that this is shaping up in a pretty big way to look like a major set of crimes against our society and against people, and people acting well outside of the bounds of their authority, whether it's Angela Merkel telling the German population, we'll let you have your freedoms back when I decide, thank you very much, through to doctors, medical professionals advocating, academics advocating various strategies. For sure, if it's based upon sound science, they can defend themselves. But this is the issue, isn't it? That we seem to have a lack of sound science going on at this point in time.
Here's the new variant. This is what the UK government has been running for the last couple of weeks. Act like you've got it. This is straight out of the behavioral insights team cadre at Sage. And this is like kind of a next level. This is beyond if you see something, say something, kind of the kind of linear war on terror, World War II type propaganda. Fritz could be anywhere, so be careful what you say. Those were the posters. Then the war on terror, if you see something, say something. Al Qaeda could be anywhere. Now this is very deep and very penetrating propaganda. So you need to act like you've got COVID, and then you're doing your part, and you're a good person, and you're obedient and compliant. But this is really twisted stuff. No one's ever seen anything like this before.
Yeah, this is extreme stuff that we're seeing in these advertising campaigns. One can only assume that the behavioral scientists are in the background on this. And what is the result of doing this? I was having a conversation with somebody. What happens when you normally go to a doctor and you've got a condition and it could be serious? Doctors will normally reassure you, even if the situation is bad. They will reassure and calm you down. So, and even in the worst case scenarios, remember a family who's a cancer doctor, having to give people very bad news and so on. The message is, go out, live your life, do. This is what my understanding is that doctors and nurses and health professionals always do. But what do we have here? We just have people who are being told to order their life around fear and terror, which is an awful thing to do. Let's go back to the example of old people restricted from access in old people's homes. This is a terrible thing to do to people who are not going to be here for very much longer. And people need to be allowed to live their lives, even if there are conditions. People need to live their lives even if they have a cancer diagnosis or have a heart disease or have any number of fatal diseases. They need to go out and embrace life, live life. That advert is all about making people scared. And I guess as commentators such as Neil Clark have been saying for ages now, it's all about control. This is about power on governments trying to keep control of people and using fear to do that. It's a terrible thing. It's a terrible thing to be doing to people. As I'm sure some people who've been involved, for example, in producing these adverts will realize at some point. At some point they'll realize that what on earth did I get caught up in? We do have historical precedents on the role of propaganda in Western countries and where it leads and how people get caught up in it and how people can't see the wood for the trees. I'm not going to name it because people should know. Yeah. But we do, there are warnings from history, and people need to be, people who are caught up in this kind of promotion, this blind promotion of what they're being told to do, need to try to sort of regain their critical faculties and just think a little bit more deeply about what it is that they're doing. And 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 in all of this, I mean, I don't know what your experience is. I mean, I think you're right to say that the situation is negative. I mean, I think there is always hope, but I think people are increasingly angry about what they're seeing going on, and I think in a way that is good, that people should be angry, and they should channel that anger into political action and trying to roll back what we've seen being rolled out over the last year. But people, I hope that when people see adverts such as that enough of them respond to it by going, I'm not going to be held prisoner by this kind of fear and this kind of messaging.
I think that it's got a very negative pushback from the public. This is just seen, this type of stuff is being seen as a bridge too far. And I think the mechanism here is this, Piers. The biggest spender, one of the biggest spenders for mainstream media outlets since the beginning of this crisis has been government. They've been buying the back pages. They've been doing the full page spreads. They've been buying the covers. They're paying above rack rates in advertising in some cases. And so there's no chance of independence by the media when you have this incestuous relationship between government and the press, like nothing we've ever seen before. I mean, you talked about the Vietnam War before. When the press had some independence, they would put the faces of the soldiers who died. I'm talking about the tail end of the war. And this was part of the anti-war effort nationally to end the Vietnam War. So the Walter Cronkites of the world, all the major networks were playing their role as independent media to bring the war to a finish by showing the dead soldiers, the dead American boys. But it's flipped now. Now the press is doing the government's work by saying, we've passed the 100,000 death milestone, and Boris is sitting there solemn on the front of the Sun with his look, and then all these different death milestones. So I think it's inverted from what it was, the drive to end the Vietnam War. It's flipped now. Now the government and the press are working really, in a sense, targeting the minds of the public to keep the policy going, to keep the crisis going. That's what it seems like to me, and I don't think it's an exaggeration.
No, I mean, it's been said terms been used several times in this talk that we've been having. That things have intensified. This is a dramatic intensification, and what you're showing there on that slide is well, yeah. I mean, this is more than Herman and Chomsky would have spoken about in the 1980s. This is very direct. This is propaganda. This is funding the media and making sure it stays on message in a very direct way. And I'm sure that the journalists in these big organizations are very conscious of their mortgages and their pay and so on, and don't want to challenge it. But what I'd say, in this point we made earlier about sort of the potential for this to be a moment where people wake up, or where there's an opportunity for proper change, is that what you can take those kind of examples and put it to people who are buying everything they're being told, and are full on lockdown, zero COVID sort of believers, is that this is going on. The government's funding the mainstream media to push this message to you, so you're getting one message. This is based upon scientists who, as you describe, are very narrowly defined, and there is clear scientific controversy over the correct response. The point I'd raise to somebody who's believing everything is that what if the government's wrong? What if the scientists who are advising the government are wrong? Okay, and if you allow that to be a possibility, then you realize how serious the situation is. Because if they're wrong, then all this propaganda is pushing, it's enabling, it's protecting a policy which is just wrong. Okay, and if you listen to the scientists, or the Great Barrington Declaration scientists, and actually a lot of the mainstream critics of lockdown, is that this policy will kill far more people than it will ever save. And that's very clear. I think they're very, very blunt about that. And I think there are scientists who argue that the academic evidence shows that that's the case, that lockdowns, restrictions will kill more people than it will ever save, do far more harm through collateral damage. Okay, now if that's the case, this should be paused for thought. And if you have governments paying the mainstream media to tell people something, and you have a small cabal of scientists doing the advice, and if they're all wrong, then we're witnessing a horrendous crime against humanity, in a sense, with this. And I suspect this is what we have, and this is what we're seeing. And this is what people should be asking themselves. Why is the government having to do this? Why is the mainstream media taking the money and behaving in this way? Why are the scientists who are questioning this being smeared in the mainstream media, etc.? There's all of the alarm bells should be ringing to anybody in their right mind with all of this. And I think that's that's the point, that people who have been advocating all of this response need to be challenged on now, sort of. And this is an argument I've increasingly made, is that, because I noticed it right from the start. I noticed before I was very careful on COVID-19 initially, saying, well, what exactly is going on, and so on. And I raised a few questions, but as soon as I was doing that, I noticed opinion leaders in the left academic clique attacking me and smearing me over social media. This is like, well, where did that come from? I've just asked a question, and so on. And so that kind of willingness to sort of really close down any kind of questioning and so on has been there right from the start with COVID-19. And I think, again, this is, alarm bells should be rung. If this is what's having to be done in order to maintain this policy, if hammering down the dissent, smearing, etc., then this is a warning sign that something's not quite right here. And then following on from that, a very big warning sign that if this is all wrong, if those scientists are wrong, and if the advice the government's pursuing, and if these vested interests who are pushing these policies don't have our best interests at heart, and that's perfectly conceivable that's the case, then this is a very bad situation. And I suppose I'm being sort of mild or tame in the way I'm talking about it. I mean, as far as I can see, with my non-expert eye on what various scientists are saying, it doesn't look a pretty picture in terms of the collateral damage. It doesn't look a pretty picture in terms of the old people's homes and what's been going on. I understand from somebody that a very large proportion of infections are being picked up within hospitals. My understanding is that the average age of people passing away with a COVID positive test is, in Germany, I understand, I could be wrong, but I understand it is slightly older than the average life expectancy.
Yeah.
This is
same in the UK and the US.
Yeah, this is incredible. So I think that there is so many aspects of this now. I think, again, this point, where do you reach a point where the bubble bursts? Where do you reach a point where people realize that, it's not normal for governments to be pouring all that money into the mainstream media in that way to push a particular message? And there's only so far they can go to, well, it's because there are these dangerous conspiracy theorists out there who are trying to tell you this is all a conspiracy, etc. How long can we keep them doing that when you've got sort of very mainstream, eminent scientists and academics saying, well, I think this is just the wrong policy response? And at what point does everyone just wake up and realize that we've turned a very bad corner? Populations do wake up. Again, there are historical examples which I won't name because you always get into trouble when you do. Populations do wake up at some point and realize we turned a corner and went down a very dark alley. I think we're in that. That's the world we're in at the moment. With important differences, but that's what we're dealing with. And it's that thing. When does the propaganda begin to just, the minds of people open up?
I appreciate your restraint. I know you'd like to say more, but we're really trying to appeal to a lot of people who might be your professional cohort, for instance, or other people who work in the press, journalists, people like this. So that's the purpose of this conversation, and we're really trying to get a little bit deeper into what's going on institutionally, talking about the psychology of it as well, our role as citizens, our relationship, our social contract with the government. So these are all serious, fundamental building blocks of post-Enlightenment Western civilization, actually, that I think it's not an exaggeration to say that these things are definitely under threat right now, and not just nationally, but globally, if you consider how this is cascaded and becomes global policy, de facto global policy. It's very serious indeed, and we could we could make a lot more stronger arguments and more emotional arguments on this, and maybe we will in the future in another discussion with other contributors as well. But I think that's all we're going to have time for this week. But I just wanted to thank you for staying overtime on this, Piers. It's a very important discussion. I know you're very passionate about it as well as you are about the topic of propaganda. You've done such great work in this over your career. But before we leave, do you want to give a shout out to our viewers with regards to anything you're working on right now, or things where they can go to see more of your work? Any stories that are really hot right now that your group's working on?
Well, the Organization for Propaganda Studies has its website, and that's still a fledgling organization. I would really what I'm most kind of focused on at the moment is the Organization Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and the scandal over Duma, and of course we have a lot of briefing notes on that, and that's a live issue and it's carrying on. We also have the working group on 9/11, the War on Terror, which is established, and that's going to be starting to become more active. And that's looking generally at propaganda in relation to the War on Terror over the last 20 years, including 9/11 itself. So, I mean, I recommend people take a look at that. But I think the core of my work, I mean, the OPCW Duma issue is a big one. This is to do with propaganda and deception in relation to a major organization, and it links in with what we've been seeing in the last 20 years. This is a very big story and issue. So, the work group has a lot of papers on that, but there are also other people, some journalists have covered this issue, and there's more to come. There's more material in the pipeline on that. And the Syrian war itself, of course, because with Biden in this, it looks like it may escalate again. So as much as COVID is critical and dominating at the moment, all of those other issues with propaganda and war, they're rolling on. And I think one of the tricks people such as us need to keep in mind at the moment is we need to make sure we keep plowing the course on issues which we have been. We don't get distracted, because you bet, sort of, as it were, our enemies or our opponents are very keen to have us all distracted completely off, say, Syria or the global war on terror. But it's important to keep doing the work on that, doing the research and so on. So I think the work I'm doing with other colleagues and in relation to those areas, I encourage people to take a look at the working group on Syria, propaganda and media. Take a look at the OPCW and the Duma issue and what other people have written about that as well.
And this issue that we talked about today, the global pandemic, this can easily be parlayed into a kind of a war effort against China. We can have that conversation later, but I'm sure we can have a very interesting conversation on that front. So, but thank you very much, Piers Robinson.
You. Good to talk.
Very, very much appreciated. And that's all we've got time for 21 Wire Live this week. I want to thank everybody for joining us on the live stream. Again, this will be available up as a recording up on our YouTube channel and at 21stcenturywire.com. Also, look at our last episodes. We had fantastic segments with Daniel McAdams from the Ron Paul Institute last week, and a fantastic review of the Biden foreign policy with Brian Berletic, who's also a special contributor at 21stcenturywire.com. Phenomenal interviews. And also former ambassador to Syria from the UK, Peter Ford, as well in a previous episode. So there's many other episodes as well. So go check those out. Thank you very much. Hopefully we will see you. We'll see you on Friday with the UK column news at 1 p.m. UK time with Mike Robinson, and I'll be live on ACR with the Sunday Wire on Sunday, our radio show. So join us there as well. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. This has been a phenomenal conversation, very enlightening, and no doubt this is just getting the ball rolling on this topic. There's so much more that we need to discuss, and that we will in the future. Take care, and we'll see you next time.